What visas are available for religious workers who want to come to the United States and work? Hi, I'm Jim Hacking, immigration attorney here in St. Louis, Missouri. Our office has handled a fair amount of religious or R-1 visas over the years, and they're actually very interesting and fun visas to work on. We really enjoy being able to work with churches and mosques and synagogues and helping them bring people to the United States to work in their house of worship as a religious worker. The visa that you use for religious workers is an R-1 visa. An R-1 visa is a visa that allows someone to come to the United States and work in a religious institution, in a religious job or vocation. So one thing you need to keep in mind about the R-1 visas is you can't be used for simple tasks at a church or synagogue or mosque. For instance, you couldn't get an R-1 visa for a custodian or for a groundskeeper or for people that just sort of maintain the church. An R-1 visa is limited to religious jobs. So say a priest or a rabbi or an imam or perhaps a liturgical worker or people that are actually involved in the religion of the church or the mosque or synagogue. So you can't just assume that an R-1 visa is going to be available for anyone that works at a house of worship. R-1 visas are available for 3 years, and there's not a cap on the number of R-1 visas that can be awarded each year, so there's not a delay on these. If the religious worker is married, they can bring their spouse or children to the United States on an R-2 visa. And so an R-1 visa lasts for 3 years, and it can be renewed for up to 2 additional years. An R-1 visa also allows a house of worship to get to know someone that they might want to sponsor for a green card. Now, getting a green card for a religious person is a much higher burden than getting an R-1 visa, but both are actually pretty difficult to get. R-1 visas take a lot of work because you have to establish 2 things. The first thing that you have to establish is that this particular employee has the background to fulfill the religious job. So USCIS is going to spend a lot of time looking at their credentials, looking at the job itself, and trying to figure out what capabilities the person brings and whether it jives with the job and whether the job is sufficiently religious. The other thing about R-1 visas that make them very time-consuming from an immigration attorney standpoint is you have to spend a lot of time establishing the bona fides or the credentials of the church itself or the religious institution. It seems that over the last 5 or 6 years, USCIS has been much more vigilant and much more stingy in handing out R-1 visas. And one of the ways they do that is checking on the validity of the house of worship. We did an R-1 visa a few years ago for a church that had been around for almost 120 years. And USCIS sent out a site investigator to look at the church, and we pointed to the cornerstone on the church that was from the early 1900s, and it was ultimately sort of ridiculous that we were having to go through all this, but because of fraud in the R-1 visa context, USCIS is much more vigilant, and they typically send out an inspector for a site visit at the house of worship. This makes it true that if a church or a religious institution hasn't been around too long, or if it's relatively small, if USCIS thinks that the church isn't legitimate or that they're not sufficiently connected to other types of congregations of the same type, then it's going to be a little bit more difficult to get an R-1 visa approved. I can almost guarantee you that you're going to get requests for evidence on an R-1 visa and that there's going to be a lot to respond to. So while, as we always say, there are some things that you can do without an immigration attorney, an R-1 visa is not something that you want to do alone. It's one of the more time-consuming things that we do here. We enjoy working on them, but you really need to get your ducks in a row in order to get an R-1 visa approved. A couple of years ago, we were doing an R-1 visa for a Bosnian mosque in St. Louis, and the Immigration Service required us to go back 3 levels in the hierarchy of the mosque. So we had to establish the Bosnian mosque affiliation with other Bosnian mosques in St. Louis. with a parent organization in Chicago, then back to Bosnia, and even back to Turkey. So it was a hard-fought case. It took a long time to process. We ultimately got it approved, but these cases are not easy and they are not simple. If you have questions about R-1 visas or about trying to sponsor a religious worker to come serve at your house of worship, give us a call, 314-961-8200, or you can email me, jim@hackinglawpractice.com. Thanks a lot.